Part 9, From Akhenaten to Thales. At the beginning of the second millennium BC, under the influence of the increasing unification and organisation of the Near Eastern states, every one of which was regarded as the mirror image of the macrocosmic state of the gods, or its prolongation, the priests and sages became increasingly concerned with questions of universal order and its ruling principle of divine archetypes and their images, of the one and the many. It would be incorrect to think that all these questions and subjects were not explored much earlier, but at that time they provoked and suggested slightly different answers due to the monistic tendency of thought. The approach to problems were investigated and dealt with by mythological and theological means, taking mythology to the limits of its expressiveness. According to Thomas Machiavelli, what would emerge from the dissolution of myth was the birth of philosophy, and its first great topic was oneness. The author is incorrect in speaking about the dissolution of myth. It is more likely that myth simply changed the imaginal form of presentation. In a certain sense, logos, a rational discourse, speech, or discursive reason, is only one particular instance of the great ontological metamyth, close to the Hindu Maya and Egyptian Heka, which governs the whole realm of becoming, that of moving images and reflections. Within this overwhelmingly magic frame, which introduces something like a mythical fundament of ontology, logos simply means significant and meaningful speech, that which is in accord with the archetypal ideas, the multidimensional human mind with all of its images, concepts, thoughts, feelings, and visions, which can be symbolically expressed orally or in writing, and has an open or hidden coherence. Therefore, as Evangelou pointed out, in this broad sense, not only great Hellenic philosophers, but every human being who is unimpaired and prepared to make careful and meaningful use of the innate logos is naturally a logical and rational being, peripatetically speaking. The Hellenic tradition insists that almost all of the first Greek philosophers, mystagogues, and scientists were pupils of the Egyptian priests. As Diodorus Siculus says, not only Orpheus took part in the feasts of the Dionysian, i.e. Osirian mysteries in Egypt, but also Homer himself visited that country. Behind the Greek obsession with geometry, which Thales is said to have brought from Egypt, stand the Egyptian methods of measurement, along with the mystical theory of forms and numbers, which grounds the use of geometry in the demiurgic cosmogony, repeated after the annual flood when the primordial hill, the noetic stone of light, emerges from the waters of Nun. Geometry and astronomy are the two disciplines to which the Greek authors most often refer, though Hellenic astronomy derives from Mesopotamia. Be that as it may, geometry and astronomy, both understood in the ancient sense of divine sciences, become pillars of an emerging cultural synthesis in Greece, which marked the appearance of a distinct rational, philosophical, and scientific discourse. Theology is also mentioned among the things learned abroad, though the Egyptian priests were reluctant to reveal the mysteries to their guests. For example, Plato is credited with having learned geometry, theology, and priestly knowledge in general during his stay in Egypt, probably around 390 BC. In his later works, Plato praised Egyptian art and music, arguing for their adoption in Greece. For Plato, the return to the ideal ancient institutions means return to Egypt, as if the deeper one goes towards the true and primordial Hellenic roots, the closer one approaches the sacred pharaonic Egypt. The tradition of Plato's theological studies in Egypt was so persistent through the whole of antiquity that it cannot be spurious. According to the geographer Strabo, about 64 BC to 23 AD, quote, "We saw there the buildings dedicated formerly to the lodging of priests, but this is not all. We were shown also the dwelling of Plato and Eudoxus, for Eudoxus accompanied Plato to this place, Heliopolis, and they established themselves here, and both resided here 13 years in the society of the priests. The fact is affirmed by several authors. These priests, so profoundly versed in the knowledge of celestial phenomena, were at the same time mysterious people, seldom communicative, and it was only due to time and adroit management that Eudoxus and Plato were able to be initiated by them into several of their theoretical speculations. But these barbarians retained the best part in their own possession." End quote. Some may argue that if these barbarians were really so lavish as to reveal the best part of their wisdom, Plato would have been a Neoplatonist more like Plotinus, and Iamblichus than like Socrates, the insatiable seeker of quarrel. The Socratic attitude, however, may be regarded as an external veil, in accordance to the ancient traditions of ritual quarrel and dramatic performances of tricksters which conceal the inner layers of esoteric wisdom. Therefore, it is not clear to what extent Plato is either Egyptian or Neoplatonic, though one should remember that Platonism cannot be viewed as entirely ahistorical. The different historical contexts dictate different rules of the game and reflect different kinds of mentalities, while the underlying metaphysical principles remain the same. The undeserved philosophical hero of all modern histories, whose reputation of the first philosopher is largely based on rather distorted or misinterpreted records of Aristotle. This Thales of Miletus, also credited with visiting the priests and astronomers of Egypt. He learned geometry from the Egyptians, according to Diogenes Laertius. Before approaching Thales and his controversial teachings, as they are attested to by later and not always credible writers, we should discuss the particular theological perspective which started the quote-unquote disenchantment of the world by rejecting sacramental symbolism, labelled as idolatry, theurgy, and traditional mythological imagery. In the 18th dynasty, 1550 to 1295 BC, of the New Kingdom in Egypt, two anti-polytheistic, or rather monistically oriented but essentially different movements appeared. One, the so-called New Solar Theology, which was attested before Amenophis IV, and continued after his fall into the late period, and two, the Amana theology of Amenophis IV, Akhenaten, who ruled 1352 to 1338 BC. The solar monotheism, suddenly introduced by Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, restructured the world and reduced it to a restricted human point of view. In traditional Egyptian imagery, both macrocosm and microcosm were regarded from the divine point of view. The observing human eye was almost excluded, and the magnificent sacred spectacles of the cosmic state, along with its permanent archetypes and unending dynamic processes, were viewed not from below, but from above and from within. The reality was depicted as the sun, diversity and unity, of the reality was depicted as the sum, diversity and unity of divine actions, which constitute metaphysical constellations at different levels of being. Not the visible phenomena, separated from the sacred prototypes, but their inner meaning was the main concern of the Egyptian priests. Their texts describe certain imaginal and noetic topographies which no average human observer has ever seen here below because, quote, it is not just the visible, but the intelligible world that counts as reality, end quote. During the short revolutionary period introduced by Akhenaten, everything was turned upside down. The multi-dimensional theophany, the pantheon of Neteru, and mythical imagery which emphasized transcendence were replaced by visible reality. At the same time, metaphysical concepts of hidden meaning and the archetypal picture of divine semiotics were replaced by physical concepts of function and causality. Akhenaten's monotheism, centered on the optics of Aten, the visible solar body, eliminated the metaphysical notion of the first time, Tep Sepi, crucial for theurgic rites, temple liturgies, and mystical ascent. The Egyptian concept of Tep Sepi, to which corresponds the later Hebrew Bereshit, in the beginning, means the principal beginning, the emergence of the divine intellect, Atum Ra, along with Cosmos Noetos, and this beginning transcends the sensible realm, being everywhere and nowhere. As the eternal presence, it constitutes the vertical Hanatic axis of return to the source and liberation. As the eternal presence, it constitutes the vertical Hanatic axis of return to the source and liberation. Instead, Akhenaten's worldview is based on the sensual appreciation of time. Spatial visibility is regarded as the dimension of physical light, when the eternal presence, usually touched through the hieratic rites and intellection, is replaced by past and future. Then cosmogony becomes embryology, and God himself begins to be equated with time, which unfolds everything. This is the exact inversion of traditional Egyptian doctrines. In the new established monotheism, God is revealed to the physical eye as the visible sun disk, but hidden from the heart, except the heart of Akhenaten, who becomes the sole intermediary between his Aten and disenchanted reality here below. Contrary to this innovation, the theology of the New Kingdom emphasized the necessity of taking God into one's heart. The possibility of mystical knowledge is open to every pious man and woman. Although this knowledge is carried in the depths of the heart, God himself is invisible. Therefore, seeing God is possible only for those transformed souls who are, quote-unquote, dead, both in the literal and the initiatory sense. Only the soul, Ba, who passed through the Osirian transformations in the Duat and is turned into the luminous spirit, Ach, can meet the gods face to face and itself become a god. In Amana religion, however, although knowledge of God is reserved for the pharaoh only, the ability to see God is granted to everybody. But this God is no longer the transcendent Amun, the hidden God whose symbols, images and names are the many gods, but the visible body of the sun, the one as the rational cause of material generation. Claiming that the meaning of the world, or its scientific truth, is only accessible to the heart of the sole expert, Akhenaten himself, the prototype of the modern scientific experts who promote the same claims, is virtually saying that reality has no mysterious divine meaning at all. Therefore, as Jan Assmann pointed out, in the Amana period explanation, scientific search for causality, replaced interpretation, symbolic hermeneutics. Quote, the more there is that can be explained, the less there is to interpret. Thus we may perhaps say that Instead of founding a new religion, Akhenaten was the first to find a way out of religion." End quote. Though he did away with Osiris and the ritualized and temple-like Osirian netherworld, which functioned as an alchemical vessel of transformation, the concept of the immortality of the soul remained intact. However, Akhenaten rejected the traditional pantheon and destroyed or damaged temples, statues, and images of the Egyptian gods in the name of Aten, who is not even a personal god in the theistic sense, but represents nature. Therefore, the visible world is nothing but an endless becoming, a transformation, Heperu, of God nature himself. The term Heper usually means manifestation, coming forth from the hidden dimension, something invisible becoming visible. But in the Amana texts, the meaning of this term is altered, because Akhenaten did away with any idea of invisibility or hiddenness. There is nothing but nature, and this nature ought to be investigated, held in wonder, praised and lived in. In sharp contrast to this monotheistic doctrine, the traditional Egyptian world is not nature because it is not natural. In the Amana religion, God is not regarded as a jealous lord who requires total loyalty, as in the early biblical tradition, which in many respects is the heir and rather indirect prolongation of Akhenaten's monotheism. Though the new theological and physiological perspective, introduced with the utmost compulsion and terror, was experienced by the pharaoh as a religious revelation, it is not, strictly speaking, a theology of will. Instead of pious servanthood, knowledge and truth are emphasized, though they are privileges of the king. The clear-cut distinction between true and false in matters of religion, inseparable from state policies, marked the idea of orthodoxy with its intolerance of any beliefs which deviated from or opposed the single doctrine regarded as unquestionably true. In the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, all theologies, cosmogonies, and their related divine names were translatable. They were not absolute at the level of myth and polysemantic hermeneutics. Therefore, not the question of orthodoxy, but that of orthopraxis, the correct performance of sacred rites based on the distinction between right and wrong in human action, was thought to be important. If the Amana religion had existed for longer, it would surely have produced a corpus of canonical sacred texts. The fall of Akhenaten's rule prevented a shift from rites and idols to scriptures, as happened in the later Semitic monotheisms. However, Akhenaten's revolution, though not long-standing, marks a period which is described by modern scholarship as the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. It is no mere accident that both Homer's epics, which probably belong to the late Assyrian period, the 8th century BC, and the biblical Exodus, the mythical and symbolic narration of Moses, who is the Egyptian priest Osaseph in Manetho's account of the departure from Egypt, are traditionally set in the 13th century BC, after the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the 20th dynasty lasting until about 1069 BC, and the collapse of political unity, the theology of will, and personal piety accelerated in Egypt, officially proclaimed by Herhor. The high priest of Amun pronounced the age of rebirth and established a new representative theocracy based on the oracles of Amun. However, the unifying idea in this period of ancient history was that of a world state, programmatically embodied by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, followed by the Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires. In such complicated conditions, the biblical tradition of the chosen people, the tribal myth of promised success and world dominion, is developed. According to Jan Assmann, quote, "The report of the Exodus stems from an authentic account of a sojourn in and departure from Egypt. But those events were experienced not by the Hebrews, but by the Hyksos, whose traditions the Hebrews inherited. Israel elevated these transmissions to the rank of a normative past and made them an integral part of its cultural memory, only at a time when the Hebrews as a people needed to draw on this past to master their present. That present, however, could not have predated the first appearance of the prophets. Hence, the literary version of the Joseph legend, the Exodus, and all other biblical references to Egypt are derived from late period Egypt, not the Egypt of the Bronze Age, in which the version known to us sets the Exodus." End quote. The transformed and reinterpreted legacy of Akhenaten is also partly inherited by the Hebrews, who regarded Egypt as a sort of mythological monster and a depository of the hated idolatry. The Egyptians' and Hebrews' abhorrence of each other was intense and permanent, perhaps due to the legacy of ideas and memories inherited by the Hebrews from the expelled Hyksos and the banished Akhenaten's rebels. Even in the time of the Renaissance, Giordano Bruno, the partisan of the spurious quote-unquote Egyptian religion, regarded the Jews with contempt. The religion of the enlightener iconoclast, Akhenaten, was a puritanical cult devoid of theurgy and metaphysical symbolism, restricting the knowable universe to the world accessible to the senses. Therefore, Jan Assmann argues that, quote, "As a thinker, Akhenaten stands at the head of a line of inquiry which was taken up 700 years later by the Milesian philosophers of nature with their search for the one all-informing principle." End quote. Of course, this line of inquiry differs considerably from the biblical theology of the divine will, which arranges and plots world history, centered on the moral and political adventures of his chosen tribe, according to the unpredictable intentions, plans, and wishes of Yahweh, the jealous personal God of Israel.